Right now, while most of the world is arguing about a ceasefire that no longer exists, something far bigger is quietly rearranging the global economy. A war that started with a handful of airstrikes has now run past 140 days, and the peace framework that was supposed to end it has just been declared dead by both sides. Somewhere in the space between those two facts, oil broke a price ceiling it hadn't touched in years. A shipping lane that carries a fifth of the planet's petroleum went silent, and America's closest allies looked their most powerful partner in the eye and said no. This is not a story about one battle. It's a story about what happens when a superpower asks the world for help and the world simply declines. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the very end of February, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iran. The stated goal was to cripple Iran's nuclear program and its network of regional proxies. Within weeks, the campaign escalated in ways few analysts predicted. Iran's supreme leader was killed in the opening strikes, a moment that would have been almost unthinkable in prior decades of shadow conflict between these two countries. Iran's response was to reach for the one lever that could hurt the entire world at once. Not just Israel or American bases in the region. That lever was the Strait of Hormuz. If you've never thought much about the Strait of Hormuz, here's why it matters more than almost any other stretch of water on Earth. At its narrowest point, it's barely 33 kilometers wide, yet roughly a fifth of all the oil the world consumes passes through it every single day. Tankers moving from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Iran itself all funnel through this one channel before reaching open ocean. For decades, war planners have treated the strait as the ultimate choke point, the place where a regional conflict could become a global one overnight. Iran has known this for just as long, and in this war, they use that knowledge. By early April, after weeks of the heaviest fighting, both sides accepted a ceasefire brokered largely through Pakistani and Qatari mediation. On June 17th, Presidents Trump and Pezeshkian signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding in Islamabad, an agreement meant to extend that ceasefire for 60 days while negotiators worked out a permanent peace. It became known as the Islamabad MOU. On paper, it looked like the beginning of the end. Iran agreed, in principle, to reaffirm it would not pursue a nuclear weapon. The United States lifted its naval blockade on Iranian ports. Frozen assets began to move. For a moment, oil prices eased and the world exhaled. But here's the pattern worth noticing, because it will matter again and again throughout this story. Every single time this ceasefire has been tested, it has broken. Not once, not twice. At least 3 separate times since April, the truce has collapsed, reignited, and limped back into some fragile form. 3 days after the Islamabad signing, Iran declared the strait closed again, citing continued strikes elsewhere as a violation of the deal's terms. Attacks on commercial tankers resumed. The United States answered with strikes inside Iranian territory. Iran answered that with missile and drone attacks on American allies across the Gulf. This is not the behavior of two sides drifting toward peace. This is the behavior of two sides that fundamentally disagree about what peace even means. And that disagreement is the real story beneath the headlines. The Islamabad MOU never actually resolved the hardest questions. It said nothing conclusive about Iran's ballistic missile program. It said nothing about Iran's network of allied militias across the region. Above all, it never settled who actually controls passage through the strait itself. The United States has consistently argued that the agreement implies an open waterway, free for any nation's ships to use. Iran has just as consistently argued that it retains the authority to control who passes and under what conditions. Two governments signed the same piece of paper and walked away with two incompatible interpretations of what they'd agreed to. That is not a diplomatic footnote. That is often exactly how wars restart. By early July, the fragile version of peace had collapsed entirely. Iranian forces struck commercial tankers transiting the strait, and United States Central Command answered with one of the largest strike packages of the entire war, hitting Iranian missile, drone, and radar sites across multiple waves. In mid-July, Iran's deputy foreign minister formally announced the suspension of its commitments under the Islamabad framework, citing what it called American violations. The war that everyone had cautiously started calling post-ceasefire was, in every meaningful sense, simply the war again. Now here's where the consequences stopped being regional and became global. As the strait effectively closed, tanker traffic didn't just slow down, it nearly stopped. On some days, only a handful of ships made the crossing where 60 or more would typically pass. The International Energy Agency, the organization founded back in 1974 specifically because of the 1973 Arab oil embargo, looked at what was happening in the Gulf and made a statement it does not make lightly. It called this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. To put that in perspective, the 1973 embargo, the event that reshaped Western energy policy for 2 generations, removed about 4.5 million barrels a day from global supply, roughly 7% of what the world used at the time. What's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is choking off more than 20 million barrels a day, close to a fifth of global oil consumption. This is not a comparable event. By raw volume, it is the largest one. Brent crude, the global benchmark, tells the story in numbers alone. It started this year trading in the mid-60s. By the height of the disruption, it had briefly touched nearly $120 a barrel, and it closed above $100 for the first time since August of 2022. The International Energy Agency's member countries responded with the largest coordinated release of strategic petroleum reserves in the organization's history, agreeing to release around 400 million barrels in an attempt to soften the blow. But strategic reserves are held separately by each member country, spread across different storage facilities, different logistics chains, different bureaucracies. Analysts estimated it could take 60 to 90 days before that oil meaningfully reached the market. In a crisis moving in days and weeks, 90 days might as well be a different era. So if the world's largest oil-consuming economies were facing a genuine supply shock, the logical move would be simple. Send naval power to secure the strait, restore safe passage, and stabilize the flow of energy that every industrialized economy depends on. And that is exactly what President Trump asked the world to do. He called on NATO members, along with China, Japan, South Korea, France, and the United Kingdom, urging what he described as the countries most affected by what he called an artificial constraint on global trade to send warships and help police the waterway. He warned, bluntly, that NATO's future would look very bad if the alliance failed to respond. And then, one by one, the answers came back. And they were almost uniformly no. Germany's response was the sharpest. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius told reporters in Berlin that this simply wasn't Germany's war, that Germany hadn't started it, and that sending more warships into the strait was unlikely to actually solve anything. A spokesperson for the German chancellor went further, stating plainly that NATO exists to defend the alliance's own territory, not to referee a conflict that Washington launched without consulting its partners in the first place. The United Kingdom's Keir Starmer struck a similar note, insisting Britain would not be pulled into what he called the wider war, and that any mission to secure the strait needed to be broader than a NATO operation alone. Spain's defense minister flatly rejected the idea of stopgap military measures, saying the actual goal should be ending the war itself, immediately, not managing around it indefinitely. Japan and Australia both indicated they had no plans to contribute ships. France's president spoke of a possible future escort mission, but only once the most intense phase of fighting had passed, and he was explicit that France considered itself outside the conflict entirely. It's worth sitting with how unusual this moment actually is. For nearly 80 years, the assumption underpinning the entire Western security order has been that when the United States calls, its allies show up, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with public grumbling, but they show up. Article 5 commitments, joint exercises, decades of interoperability, all of it was built on the premise that American and allied interests were, at the core, the same interest. What just happened in the Gulf tested that premise in the most direct way possible, not with a hypothetical crisis, but with an active war disrupting the actual global economy. And a significant bloc of America's closest allies looked at that test and decided their national interest and Washington's foreign policy had quietly diverged. Now, it would be too simple to frame this purely as allies abandoning a friend in need, and a fair-minded analysis has to take the European position seriously rather than dismiss it. There is a genuine, defensible argument behind the refusal, and it deserves to be stated in its strongest form. The war began, from the European perspective, as a unilateral decision by Washington and Israel, one made without meaningful consultation with NATO partners beforehand. Germany's government was explicit about this. NATO's founding purpose is collective defense of its own members' territory, not enforcement of a conflict that one member entered on its own initiative. From that view, sending European warships into an active war zone to bail out a crisis Washington created, without Washington first pursuing a genuine verified ceasefire, isn't allied solidarity. It's being drawn into open-ended military exposure with no clear exit and no say in how the war started. Given that the ceasefire had already failed at least 3 times, several European governments could reasonably ask what a fourth set of warships would actually accomplish that overwhelming American naval power in the region could not. That argument has real weight. But it's also worth noting what it conveniently sidesteps, because these governments are not simply bystanders benefiting from cheap analysis. Germany, Japan, South Korea, and the broader European economy are all deeply exposed to Gulf energy flows, arguably more exposed in relative terms than the United States itself, which has far greater domestic production capacity than it did in 1973. If the strait remains closed for months, the economic pain lands hardest not in Washington, but in Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Seoul. So the refusal to send ships isn't simply about legal principle, it's also a bet, whether stated openly or not, that someone else, most likely the United States and Gulf states, will eventually absorb the military risk of reopening the strait. while everyone else absorbs the economic benefit once it reopens. Some analysts have described this as a version of the classic burden-sharing dilemma that has quietly defined NATO politics for decades. Allies willing to enjoy the security guarantee, less willing to pay for it when the invoice actually arrives. There's a historical parallel worth pausing on here because it may explain part of why Trump's demand landed so poorly. In 1973, when the original oil embargo hit, the countries facing shortages didn't have much of a choice about how to respond, since the crisis was purely economic, a deliberate production cutoff by producer nations angry over Western support for Israel in that year's war. There was no active shooting war for outside militaries to wade into. This crisis is structurally different. Sending warships into the Strait of Hormuz right now doesn't just mean securing a shipping lane, it means potentially becoming a direct combatant in an active, ongoing war against a state that has already demonstrated a willingness to strike military assets belonging to countries it considers hostile. That is a fundamentally higher stakes request than simply asking allies to help stabilize a market. It's possible that this distinction, more than any lack of loyalty, explains why the answer came back the way it did. Whatever the underlying reasoning, the practical effect has been the same. The United States is, for the moment, largely alone in bearing the military cost of keeping the world's most important oil choke point from collapsing entirely, even as the economic cost is shared globally through crude prices that every country now has to pay. That imbalance is not sustainable indefinitely, and it raises a question that goes well beyond this specific war. If a crisis this severe, the largest oil disruption in recorded history according to the IEA itself, isn't enough to produce a unified allied military response, what would be? Is there a version of a global crisis anymore that automatically triggers collective action among America's traditional partners? Or has that assumption quietly expired, waiting for a moment exactly like this one to reveal it? There's another layer worth understanding because it explains why this war keeps reigniting instead of settling into a stable ceasefire, the way many previous Middle Eastern conflicts eventually have. Iran's calculation appears to treat the Strait not as collateral damage from the war, but as its primary weapon in the war. Conventional Iranian military power is badly outmatched by the combined force of the United States and Israel. What Iran does have is geography, and geography, in this case, happens to be worth roughly a fifth of the global oil supply. Every time Tehran reopens the strait even partially, it loses leverage. Every time it closes the strait again, it inflicts economic pain on the entire world. Pain that, crucially, falls heaviest on countries that aren't even direct participants in the war. That's a strategic logic worth naming clearly. Iran isn't just fighting the United States and Israel militarily, it's using global energy dependence as a form of indirect pressure on every economy that relies on Gulf oil, hoping that economic pain elsewhere eventually translates into diplomatic pressure on Washington to end the war on terms more favorable to Tehran. It is possible that this is exactly the strategy Tehran is running. It's also possible, as some analysts argue, that Iran's leadership is simply reacting defensively to strikes it cannot otherwise counter, and that the strait closures are less a calculated strategy than the only card left to play. Both interpretations are consistent with the available facts, and neither can be confirmed with certainty from the outside. What's not in dispute is the price the rest of the world is paying for that uncertainty. Shipping insurance rates in the Gulf have spiked to reflect genuine war risk. Airlines and industries dependent on jet fuel and diesel are absorbing costs that eventually reach consumers. The IEA has gone as far as recommending that member countries encourage citizens to travel less and rely more on electricity than gas heating, an extraordinary piece of public guidance that echoes almost exactly the energy conservation messaging of the 1970s. History doesn't repeat, but here, it's rhyming loudly enough that policymakers who lived through the 70s energy crisis are the ones now advising governments on how to respond to this one. So where does that leave the world, 140 days in, with the peace framework declared dead and no clear off-ramp visible? A few things appear true, based on what's verifiable right now. The military balance overwhelmingly favors the United States and Israel, and there's little indication Iran can sustain a conventional war indefinitely. But Iran doesn't need to win the war militarily to keep inflicting damage. It only needs to keep the strait unstable long enough to make the economic cost of the conflict outweigh, in the eyes of enough governments, the political cost of pushing harder for peace. That's a very different kind of war than the one that started on February 28th. One measured less in territory and more in oil futures, insurance premiums, and how many ships are willing to risk the crossing on any given day. And that brings us to the question that actually matters more than who wins the next round of strikes. Because sooner or later, this war will end, one way or another, through exhaustion, negotiation, or escalation so severe that neither side can sustain it further. The far bigger and more permanent story is what this war revealed about the structure of the world underneath it. It revealed that the assumption of automatic Western unity, the idea that a crisis serious enough would always produce a coordinated Allied response, may no longer hold. It revealed that a mid-sized regional power, without a modern navy or air force capable of matching its adversaries, can still hold the global economy at partial ransom simply by controlling the right 33 kilometers of water. And it revealed that when the bill for a superpowers war comes due, even close, decades-old allies will read the fine print very, very carefully before agreeing to pay it. Let's go back to that phrase for a moment, because it's doing more work than it first appears to. The largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the largest since the 1970s, not the worst in recent memory, the largest ever recorded. It's worth asking why an agency built specifically to prevent and respond to oil shocks would choose language that strong, knowing exactly how it would ripple through markets the moment it was said out loud. One interpretation is that the IEA was simply describing reality as precisely as it could, using the clearest comparison available so governments would understand the scale of what they were facing and act accordingly. Another interpretation, offered by some market analysts, is that the statement itself became part of the crisis, a kind of self-fulfilling signal that pushed traders, insurers, and governments to price in worst-case assumptions faster than the physical facts on the ground strictly required. Both readings can be true at once. Language from institutions like the IEA doesn't just describe markets, it moves them. And in a crisis this fragile, the words chosen by a handful of officials in Paris carried consequences measured in billions of dollars within hours. It's also worth pausing on the strangeness of watching a nearly 50-year-old organization, founded specifically because of the 1973 embargo, essentially rediscover its founding purpose in real time. For decades, the IEA's emergency stockpile mechanism functioned almost like an insurance policy nobody expected to actually use, a Cold War-era safeguard that occasionally got a modest test during hurricanes or brief supply hiccups, but never anything approaching its original design threshold. This war forced that mechanism into its largest activation ever, at a scale its architects in the 1970s may not have fully anticipated even as they built it. There's a kind of dark symmetry to that. The institution built to prevent a repeat of history ended up needing to respond to something history had, in raw numbers, actually exceeded. Now widen the lens again, because the oil market isn't the only place this war is quietly reshaping incentives. Consider what's happening to countries that aren't directly involved in the fighting at all, but sit adjacent to it. Gulf states like Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia have found themselves in an unusual position, geographically at the center of the crisis, economically damaged by the closure of shared shipping lanes, and yet diplomatically useful to both sides as mediators. Pakistan's role as the broker of the Islamabad talks gave it a level of international visibility and leverage it hasn't held in decades, elevating Islamabad, at least briefly, into the center of great power diplomacy. It's a reminder that wars this large don't just create winners and losers among the combatants, they create winners and losers among the bystanders too, depending entirely on geography, relationships, and who happens to have a phone line open to both warring capitals when the fighting needs to pause. And then there's the question of what happens to the idea of deterrence itself, because that's really what's being tested underneath all of this. For most of the post-Cold War era, the working assumption in Washington was that overwhelming American and Allied military power would deter smaller states from taking actions that seriously threatened global stability, and that if deterrence failed, decisive force would end the crisis quickly. Iran's strategy in this war challenges that assumption directly. Tehran cannot match American or Israeli firepower in any conventional sense and hasn't tried to. Instead, it has repeatedly demonstrated that even a militarily weaker state can impose sustained, global-scale costs simply by controlling a geographic choke point and being willing to absorb retaliatory strikes in exchange for that leverage. If that strategy proves durable, even partially over the coming months, it won't just affect how this specific war ends. It will likely influence how other geographically vulnerable powers, from smaller Gulf states to countries near other maritime choke points, calculate their own options the next time they find themselves in a serious dispute with a much larger power. Some analysts argue this could set a precedent that outlasts the war itself, teaching future actors that choke point leverage can substitute for conventional military strength. Others argue Iran's position is more unique than replicable, built on decades of specific preparation around this one waterway, and that the lesson may not transfer as cleanly elsewhere. It's too early to know which view history will vindicate. There's one more thread worth pulling before we come back to where this all points. Notice how differently this crisis has unfolded compared to the wars most documentaries default to as reference points. This isn't a war being fought primarily over territory, and it isn't, at its core, a war being fought to overthrow a government. Even though regime change was clearly part of the initial strategic thinking in Washington and Jerusalem, it has increasingly become a war fought over the terms of an economic relationship, over who gets to set the rules for a shipping lane that the entire global economy quietly depends on functioning normally. That shift matters because wars fought over economic terms tend to end differently than wars fought over territory or ideology. They often end not with a clear military victor, but with an exhausted stalemate that both sides can plausibly describe as a version of victory, precisely because the actual objective, control over the flow of a resource, is inherently negotiable in a way that occupied territory or a toppled government is not. That may, in fact, be the most likely outcome here, based on everything visible so far. Not a decisive military resolution, but a grinding, repeatedly broken ceasefire process that eventually produces an arrangement neither side fully trusts, propped up by outside monitors, temporary compromises over strait passage, and enough ambiguity in the language that both Washington and Tehran can tell their own populations they achieved their core objectives. That's speculation, not certainty, and anyone claiming to know precisely how or when this ends should be treated with real skepticism. Wars like this one have a track record of confounding even the analysts closest to the negotiating table. The real question then isn't who wins the next skirmish in the Strait of Hormuz, or even when this particular ceasefire attempt might finally hold. The real question is what kind of world order remains once every country has learned exactly how far its allies are actually willing to go, and exactly how much economic pain the rest of the world will quietly tolerate before someone else is forced to act. Because that lesson, once learned, doesn't disappear when the war finally ends. It becomes the starting assumption for every crisis that comes after it.